It's really important to plant native plants, no matter the type of garden you're planning on having. Ecosystems are very fragile, so introducing something that's not normal leads to some negative side effects. Non-native plants tend to take over the surrounding balanced culture, which leaves less area for native plants to grow. Planting them also spreads biological pollution by decreasing biodiversity, and can sometimes introduce diseases that the native plants have never seen before and are weak to, which further kills them off. This becomes even more serious when you consider that habitat loss is one of the main reasons pollinators are going extinct. Here are some things to take into consideration when thinking and researching which native plants to grow. When you're looking for plants, make sure their details match the location you want your garden in. If your garden is in the sun for a majority of the day, then look for plants that like the sun. Keep your goal in mind as well. If you don't want to worry about your garden, then pick plants that don't need much water at all. If you really like the idea of taking time each day to work on your garden, then choose plants that like a lot of attention. The height and width of the plants when they're fully grown is important to keep in mind too, so you know how many plants you can fit without crowding them. The Standard Design Group, the Theodore Payne Foundation, and the Hahamunga Native Plant Nursery are great places to buy plants. They all have a good supply of native plants you can choose from. Next, we'll talk about preparing the soil. Depending on the type of soil you have, you might want to do some things to make it better for planting. If you want a really small garden, then you might just need to churn the soil a little, as oxygen is always really healthy for the soil. If you want a bigger project or a bigger garden, then it might be worth it to look into sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is a good technique because it can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. Mulch is also important to consider. Lots of people mix up mulch and compost, but they're not the same thing. Compost is previously organic material that broke down into biologically active material. Mulch is any material, organic or inorganic, that covers a soil surface. There are many different types of mulches, both organic and inorganic. I'm going to focus on organic because it's the most varied type and the most beneficial. Organic mulch decomposes and releases the good nutrients into the soil. It also keeps the soil cooler and damper. You can put down wood chips in different states of decomposing and pine needles, straw, or bark. Many of these have different benefits and drawbacks and details you should consider when making your garden. For example, tree bark lasts a long time and is pretty durable, so it doesn't get swept away in the wind. It's also a really strong barrier that keeps weeds from growing. It has some drawbacks, though, in that it's so big it could impede the plant's growth, it can prevent water from reaching the soil, and it can attract termites. Local governments and tree logging companies often dump mulch at parks around the community, and it's free to pick up. If you search up free mulch drop and then the name of your city, something will probably show up. If you want a bigger load, then you can also call the tree trimming companies directly. They often have an excess amount of wood chips and are always looking to give them away. For sheet mulching, the bare minimum is to place 1 or 2 layers of cardboard down, then dump 2 to 3 inches of mulch on top of that. The cardboard and mulch will decompose, leaving the soil super healthy and rich. While it's still solid before decomposing, it will also act as a weed blocker, stopping weeds like grass from popping up and choking off your native plants. But you could get even more complicated by putting a lot of different layers. You can add mulch, straw, cardboard, compost, and weeds/grass/twigs. An important detail to note with sheet mulching, if you're planning on adding cardboard, use delivery packages as they usually use soy-based ink, which is biodegradable, and it's a good way to reuse all that otherwise wasted material. But it's super important to check for tape and other materials that don't decompose, like staples, and take them out of the cardboard. You also need to prepare the area beforehand. If you have a lot of weeds like grass, it's probably best to clear them. You don't have to, as they'll just decompose, but it helps the cardboard lie flat. You can just pull them and place them down, and it decomposes along with all the cardboard and mulch. You should also clear any non-native plants or dead bushes, especially if they're big. It also helps to water each layer before placing the next layer, as it speeds up the decomposing process and keeps every layer flat. Irrigation is probably the most complicated topic we'll cover. There's really so much information out there and so many little choices to make. It can also seem really frustrating as it's one of the less forgiving parts of the gardening process. If you don't get measurements correct, or if you get the wrong material, you can end up with a leak or a fault in the system. Fortunately, just like sheet mulching, you can generally make it as simple or as complicated as you want. A benefit about drip irrigation is that it pairs really well with California native plant gardens and drought-tolerant gardens. It saves a lot of water because no water is lost from evaporation. It's also pretty hands-free. Once you set up the system and start the timer, you only need to occasionally check in for leaks or clogs in the system. A drawback is that the water is only coming from one place, so some plants might develop roots in a clump around that one area, instead of branching out. You can mitigate this by placing a couple of emitters around the plant, or moving the emitters further from the plant every month or so. It's also pretty flexible. You can drip irrigate a wonky-shaped piece of land, or you can easily irrigate straight formations. You can irrigate a sloped terrain or a flat terrain, and you can choose to bury it or keep it above ground. The basic elements include the head of the system and the body of the system. The head of the system has all the special tools. This is the order it's usually set up in. First, you connect the backflow preventer into your spigot. This prevents dirty water from traveling from the emitter up into your drinking water supply. You can also have a filter that strains the water coming from your spigot into your irrigation system. This makes sure no big chunks clog up the emitters. Then you have your timer. This is the brains of the operation. The timer controls the whole system. If your garden is on a slope, it's good to have an air valve. This ejects the air that is stuck in the pipes, which allows the water to flow freely. Lastly, the pressure regulator makes sure that the pressure of the water coming from your house, which can be anywhere from 20 psi to 65 psi, is decreased so it doesn't end up bursting your pipes. It's good to have this as close to the end of the head as possible. Each tool you screw on your head decreases the water pressure a little. So if your pressure regulator is at the beginning and it takes your pressure from 65 down to a safe 20, then once the water goes through everything else, your pressure might sit around a 10 or 15, which isn't enough pressure. The types of materials and tools you buy depend on a couple of factors about your individual garden, including if it's above ground or below ground, if it's sloped or not, and whether or not it's in the sun a lot.